Well, today I thought I'd go over the first part and a small two-part thing about metrics. People love metrics. Metrics are one of those things in the airport business books that people feud over. It's the narcissism of small differences. They have all sorts of disagreements, from quips like, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, to I'm sure there's some dimming quip of like, if you're measuring it, you're destroying it. Ho ho ho. I make fun. As always, when it comes to something like metrics, when it comes to your digital transformation, improving how you're doing your software, running your business by being really good with software, the thing I'm always talking about. I like to divide things up into, let's call them technical metrics and business metrics. And so let's go through some of them, right? Like, if you know what you're doing, you don't need advice. And if you figured out what works for you through trial and error, then that's great. And there's always exceptions and so forth and so on. But I always like to provide a baseline of things to start with instead of just sort of greeting card level inspiration for things. I guess, yay me, whatever. There's an article that I wrote here in the financial IT website, kind of going over these two types of metrics. Now, let me get a clean view of this. So that you can just see my lovely text instead of all the other stuff there, which is fine. But let's go over these metrics, right? So metrics in this case are especially important when you're looking to improve the way your organization does software. You're constantly learning and running through an experimental cycle, right? Of like, here's a theory of how to solve a problem, a theory of even what the problem is. Here's a way to measure if I was going the right direction, if the feature worked for someone, if the way we've changed the organization is working. So you need some way of measuring, as I reminded people of, and evaluating these things. So, come up with some metrics. So first of all, so here again, we're talking about doing software, right? Like, and doing software on a weekly basis where you come up with a feature. Here's let's use a very common example. Someone signing up for a new bank account, right? And we're going to come up with a theory of how we can get them to complete that sign up, right? So that's one of the challenges you have getting customers in banking, is they've actually got to complete the process. And I can attest to this. When I was moving over to Amsterdam, I was trying to get a local bank account, and I signed up for a couple of them. And like, just the process is very onerous, right? Like, you would have to do verification and do things. So there's a couple that I started signing up with, like these new fintech banks, and it was just really hard to complete it. So the process of acquiring customers and getting them to finish it is difficult. Now, kind of to the testament of how, I actually think it's really difficult for these fintech startups, for these new banks to come about, because it's hard to acquire customers. Like, I tried with a couple of them. I even got on a video verification with someone. But ultimately, when I arrived at Schiphol in the airport, I just went to the local ABN bank there, totally signed up for a bank, and was good to go in person. That process was much easier in person. So let's go with that, account completion. You might have a theory that one of the major blockers is getting verification of who that person is. And I actually did experience this with, I was trying to sign up with Bunk. I forget BUNK, which is, if you're a native English speaker, do not choose the word bunk for your bank name. It doesn't really engender the kind of trust you want, but whatever. So I signed up for it, and one of the barriers was you need to verify. And I guess they had a theory that, like, let's do an in-video verification where you called up someone and there was an actual person there, and I kind of held up my passport and see if that's a better way of verifying. And it was. Like, I remember sitting in my closet and doing it. But that would be something that you want to measure. So that would be an example of like one of these business level metrics, right? What we're looking at is, we think that this will drive more adoption because putting in this feature will mean that people will complete the application and they'll actually sign up for an account. Now, after that, you would have, do they transfer money to that account, right? Because it's sign up for an account and you got to move money to it. And how could we make that easier? Now, you could say like, well, in European banking, it's great. Like, you just put in your IBAN number and boom, you're good to go. Like, you can transfer money pretty effectively. Now, if you are signing up for international accounts, things get a lot more complicated. The whole point is, for these business metrics, right? Think about the workflow that you're going through, right? With the banking, where it's acquiring the customer, getting them to give you their information, to verify who they are. Then the next metric you want to track is actually signing up for those accounts. And you need to measure these and come up with what they are as I go into here, right? You can see that there's a couple that I've highlighted here that are kind of generic type of business things. I think when they published this, they took out the links that I had there. Let's look at 4 ways to start with. With the banking thing, I went over kind of like, here's a workflow to go through: acquisition, verification, and transferring money to it. Now, another ongoing metric that you would probably want to have with the bank is there actual activity on these accounts, right? Like, so I actually do have one of these fintech banks, and I think I have like 30 euros in it, and I haven't used it for 2 years. So that should be a distressing metric for them, that I'm not actually doing anything with it. Or I don't know, maybe they don't care because they get this fractional percentage off of my 30 euros, but whatever. So let's look at finally kind of some of the common sort of models of metrics. A very common metric is like buying something, which is, if you'll notice, this is classic e-commerce stuff from the 90s, is that one of the primary problems is finding the product is generally pretty easy, but getting people to actually check out and transact is a big deal. So you'll notice that if you have an empty cart for a lot of products, if you wait half a day, I guess maybe a day, they'll email you a coupon that you can get 10% off if you transact, or 5% or whatever. And so you can see they're measuring if people actually complete their purchase, and they've come up with a theory of how to move them along that line. Strictly buying something, spending money, is the ultimate metric, but it's not quite the only metric, especially if, like the government, you're nonprofits. One of them is, let's call it digital take-up, as written here. And I think you could also call that adoption or using something. A couple of episodes ago, I talked about, in the bottlenecks episode, I talked about awareness is also a bottleneck that you might have that is a little hard to solve with software. But if people don't even know that you have this service or this product out there, then that's a bottleneck that you need to think about as well, right? Like, how do we drive people knowing, I guess in the case of a government, that when they want to renew some license or something, they can go online and renew it totally online instead of going in office, right? And that's an example of the value of product thinking in software, right? So on the business side, you'll want to be measuring, are people using this new license re-sign up, or this new form they're filling out on a government site? What's the take up of the software that we have? And on the software side, you want to monitor the same thing. What you want to do is have those, look at that. You want to have those two groups come together in a product-centric way of thinking, not just the software project, not just the business side. And they need to think like, so do we have sufficient marketing? Is there sufficient awareness to drive people to take things up? And if there is sufficient awareness, however we deem that, are people actually using it? Why are they not using it, right? Like, do they have to sign in first to use it, and getting them to sign in is difficult? I mean, you go through all these different ways of experimenting why people aren't using it. So then, as I kind of went over, right, there's the completion rate that you have, right? So when they're signing up for that license, or that bank sign up, I was saying, how many people complete the process, do the full thing end to end? And then another side of that is, and this is especially valuable for a lot of organizations, is how long does it take the internal workflow approval? To use one of my overused examples, as I recall, so when Liberty Mutual entered the Australian motorcycle insurance business, a business that they entered in like 6 months, and then ended up doubling the average closing rate, the average kind of sales rate for insurance, by taking I think a pretty innovative approach, helped out by software. One of the things they measured was the amount of time it would take agents to approve an insurance policy, right? And there's a lot of things involved in that. There's kind of looking up, how much insurance they can book, kind of looking up information about the person to kind of get an idea of what a quote is, so forth and so on. And so thinking about how long does it take to respond to that service, right? That's another business metric to constantly be looking at and whittling down. And then also there's, a very good one to focus on is cost per transaction. And this is always a bit tricky, right? Like, because sometimes, oftentimes a cost is positive. If a cost is positive, it's like good to incur a cost, an investment, as we like to call it, right? So you don't want to assume that we should always be whittling the cost down. Sometimes, if you spend more on a transaction, you'll get a bigger payoff, right? Like, if you invest more, you get a bigger payoff if the investment goes well. However, you often think about cost in terms of time something takes, or the time you're paying in labor, or it could also be like the time you're paying for awareness or advertisement. But this is something that SaaS-driven companies and startups pay a lot of attention to. They'll call it cost of acquisition, all sorts of things like that. But think about how you can constantly measure what the cost for a transaction is of doing this, and start measuring that as well. And then finally, User satisfaction or customer experience or things like that. There's all sorts of models. Someone like Forrester has a lot of ways of measuring user satisfaction and use surveys. There's all sorts of models out there for this. But, it's good to have a meter of like, what do people think of this service, right? I wouldn't only use that. It's dangerous to only pay attention to that because those other metrics, namely how much money you're making, I would almost say are more valuable than user satisfaction. I mean, user satisfaction and customer experience is almost, it can be a leading metric, but it's something more that you kind of want to maintain some satisfaction. And if you see it start to dip, you should probably start to worry because that means your churn rate, your customer retention is going to go down, right? So for example, let's go back to banking. Right? Like, again, I think banking is a weird industry because it's so heavily regulated that it's kind of hard to do a lot of innovative things that kind of prey on people's desire to do things. If it was really easy to churn for me to convert to a new bank and that bank was better in some features, I would move to that because my user satisfaction was low. For example, here in the Netherlands, when Apple Pay was first introduced, only ING had Apple Pay for 3, 4, maybe even 6 months. I thought many times that at my bank, ABN or whatever, they didn't have Apple Pay. And I kept thinking like, oh, I should switch to ING just so I can use Apple Pay. My user satisfaction, it was kind of envy driven. Now, I never did, which is telling, right? However, that idea did enter my mind and my user satisfaction was pretty low. That's kind of an idea of one type of metrics you can be tracking, your business metrics. Now, you can go over, I'll put a link to this full article over at tanzutalk.com for today's episode. I'll probably call it like, don't screw up your business metrics. That's a good title for it. And you can read the full article. Now, of course, this is just based on my one of my books called The Business Bottleneck. And if you remember the premise of the Business Bottleneck, I need to put a link directly on Tanzu Talk here. But the premise of the Business Bottleneck is that, as I was kind of going over with business metrics, that we can get really good at doing software. The problem is going to become that if we as development, as IT, are good at putting software out on a weekly basis, and we don't have input from the business, we're not tracking those business metrics, we're going to encounter another bottleneck. Now, one that I didn't put in here that I would put in nowadays is kind of on the front end of the customer life cycle or doing business, which is awareness and acquisition. I think is an important one that I missed in this write-up. But whatever. It's about 80 pages. You can go to, I'll put a link to it over there that you can click on in the YouTube video to download and at the end of the video. Or you can go to cote.pizza to download it, or at tanzutalk.com, or just search for the Business Bottleneck and try that out. Now, also, if you're really interested in kind of kicking off how you start to improve the way your business functions based on being good at software, act like a tech company, or you're just looking to improve the way you do your existing software, you should schedule some free office hours with us. Now, yes, of course, this is part of our customer acquisition, where we're trying to partner with you and make sure that works out. More generally, now that you know that, if you do it right, you can hustle us and just get some free consulting, and maybe it'll actually work out, and we'll start that partnership where you become a customer of ours. You can fill this out. If you go to tanzutalk.com, you can scroll down and see where the office hours are. Also, you click right up there. I think I'll have a link to it. I think you can schedule like an hour, maybe even half a day, depending on what's going on, and you can start to get some consultative work, not only thinking about new type of business, but more importantly for most existing organizations, how you can modernize your application portfolio so that you start to get to that point where you can deploy things reliably on a weekly basis. The next couple of days, I'll finish out that article by talking about the technical metrics and also whatever the other metrics were in there. If you want to check those out, tune in next time. Bye-bye. Well, hey, everyone. Boy, that sounds stupid. I think I figured out you do the stream and you just kind of mess around. And your archival thing you put in YouTube, you can edit. Because, when I watch other people streaming, they're basically like this all the time. All right, ooh. What? But the problem with...